What is it, Freddy?
Do you see the small vent on the floor?
Freddy, what are you talking about?
Have you ever heard of Among Us?
Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The Five Nights at Freddy series has made a lot of money for creator Scott Cawthon. No one really disputes that. The dude is definitely ballin' right now. During the research for my Poppy Playtime video, I was told that Scott Cawthon had offered to buy Poppy Playtime, and when I asked Enchanted Mob if he could confirm or deny the rumor, he replied with no comment. The fact that it's even conceivable that Scott had offered to buy something like Poppy Playtime shows you just how rich the guy is, and just how successful FNAF has been. While Scott is a private guy who doesn't openly flaunt his wealth, we've seen incredibly large, generous donations from him, including $500,000 during MatPat's St. Jude stream. Most indie games fail, it's just a fact. This famous article from 2017 explains it in no uncertain terms. Your indie game will flop and you will lose money. That's okay. If your motivation for making an indie game is getting rich, you're in the wrong business. People make indie games out of passion, and it's best to go into it with zero expectations. This was true for Scott as well. He made games for years without any financial success. However, what happens when you do succeed? What happens when you're Toby Fox and you make Undertale and it goes on to make tens of millions of dollars or whatever? I've always been fascinated by just how huge an indie game made by one person can become, and I've always wondered, how much money do you make when your little game series blows up into a massive franchise with merch and movie deals and the like? How much do people like Toby Fox and Scott Cawthon actually earn upon achieving such incredible success with their near budgetless indie games? Millions surely, but tens of millions, right? Hundreds? I was curious, I wanted to know. I ran into problems pretty quickly. When you Google Scott Cawthon net worth, the result is a bunch of those auto-generated celebrity net worth sites, and all of them seem to cite this same $60 million figure. They don't explain where that number comes from though, so I have zero confidence in these sites. Thus, I decided to try to do my own calculation.
It looks like Theft King doesn't feel like editing. Let's give him some motivation. Press the red subscribe button now to administer a controlled shock.
Wait, what? Unfortunately, determining how much money the FNAF series has made is difficult. Scott Games is a private company, and thus we aren't privy to their quarterly financial reports. Furthermore, a tremendous amount of the franchise's revenue surely comes from merchandise. In spite of their inconsistent quality, Scott's partnerships and license agreements with companies like Funko have surely proven incredibly lucrative, and there are a lot of them. Scott has partnered with individual creators like Game Theory's MatPat, who sells FNAF merchandise on Theoryware. Dawko sells FNAF plushies on his Hex shop, and just to say, I own those and they're amazing. Dawko really nailed it. It goes beyond merchandise too. Owning a franchise like FNAF provides a ton of other potential revenue streams. Optioning or fully licensing the film rights, crossover integrations with other games, FNAF-sponsored cereal boxes, your imagination is basically the limit. Crunching all those numbers is impossible. The data just isn't publicly available. The best one can do is throw out a ballpark number, but it would be such a big range, it'd end up being meaningless. As a result, I decided to try and narrow the scope of my investigation. How much money have the FNAF games made? Is that 60 million number close to accurate? Too low? Too high? By estimating the amount that the FNAF games have made, we can get a pretty good idea as to how accurate this random number is, and we can at least establish a baseline and be able to assert that Scott has likely made a minimum of however much. Considering merchandising revenue often exceeds game sales, it's important to keep in mind that whatever number we come up with, Scott's actual earnings are surely substantially higher. One problem though, we don't have public sales figures. The games are sold on digital marketplaces like Steam, the Apple App Store, and the Google Play Store, and they just don't tell us how many copies were sold, let alone the price they were sold at. Steam is especially tricky as there are frequent sales that heavily discount the game. Even if we had the sales numbers, it's not enough to just multiply that by the price. Not everyone paid the same amount for the game. Even more complicated is the fact that games are often priced differently in different regions. An indie game's expenses are all upfront development-related costs. Once the game is out, you want to sell it to people for as much as they're willing to pay, and in some regions you'll sell more copies and ultimately make more money by pricing the game lower. Fortunately, Steam offers a lot of public data, and there are a lot of sites that do a decent job inferring how many copies of a game were sold using publicly available information. There's SteamDB, Steam Charge, there's a bunch, but I ended up going with Gameria, which apparently requires a paid subscription. I went with them after cross-checking their sales estimates with developers that I'm friends with. They confirmed that Gameria's estimates were very accurate, so it seems that right now they're among the more reliable sources for this type of data. FNAF 1 sold just over 2.5 million copies on Steam. The margin of error is about 50,000 sales, which is obviously a lot, but these numbers are going to get so large that 50,000 ends up being pretty negligible. The game cost $5 in the US, well, $4.99, but that penny won't matter. It's a little more expensive in Israel, Australia, and Switzerland, but it's substantially lower in most other regions. It's probably safe to assume that most sales come from the English-speaking market, though the game was discounted throughout the years, and those periods can often account for a substantial portion of the numbers. I decided to be as conservative as possible. Let's say that the average price per sale was $3.30. That comes to just over $8.2 million of gross revenue. However, Steam takes 30% of that. It's pretty steep. Better than Roblox at least, who takes 70%. Regardless, after this, it leaves Scott with about $5.8 million. Let's remember that this is from the Steam sales alone. FNAF did extremely well on iOS, and while the revenue per sale is lower, I have no doubt it made serious money as well. Something to mention is that while ClickTeam is listed as the publisher of FNAF 1, I suspect that Scott utilized ClickTeam professional services for that, in which case he likely just paid a flat fee, and ClickTeam isn't getting any recurring revenue from sales of the game. I think Scott takes home all 5.8 million or whatever. FNAF 2 sold about 1.2 million copies on Steam. However, Scott charged $8 for this one. The regional pricing distribution is a little more aggressive than FNAF 1, so in the interest of being as conservative as possible, I'm going to say that FNAF 2's average price point was $4.20. Yo! So we multiply, we account for Steam's 30% cut, and we get just under $3.7 million. So our running total is just under $9.5 million from the first 2 games on Steam alone. I repeated this simple process for the rest of the classic FNAF games, well, the ones that cost money at least. I understand that this isn't especially scientific or anything, but that's not the point. We're not trying to find out exactly how much money Scott has made. We're trying to ballpark whether the 60 million number that gets thrown around online is at all conceivable. Looking at the results, I estimate that Scott made over $20 million from the sales of the first 5 FNAF games on Steam alone. So okay, some of you might be thinking that Scott being worth $60 million might not actually be too far off. $20 million from Steam, then another $40 million from everything else. That seems reasonable, right? Well, while it's true that Steam is the place that us core PC gamers buy most of our games, and while it's true that FNAF's initial popularity was with a core PC gaming audience, the series has grown so much larger than that in the last couple of years. Five Nights at Freddy's has become crazy mainstream. A lot of casual and younger gamers surely first experienced it not through the Steam releases, but through the mobile ports. To this day, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 remains among the most popular games on the iOS App Store. The iPad version remains among the top 30 most popular paid apps on the entire App Store, and the iOS version is well within the top 50. That's most popular paid apps, not just games, all apps. So yeah, while the mobile ports are priced much lower at only $3, they sell like crazy. This site estimates that in June 2022, FNAF 1 sold 10,000 copies and made $60,000. This is an 8-year-old game. Imagine how much revenue it must have generated in its launch window when the hype was at its peak. Now consider that this is only FNAF 1. The other FNAF games had mobile releases too. They also have paid console releases. These all start to add up. Then we have to factor in the books. The first was a New York Times bestseller, and the fact that they keep writing and publishing these things indicates to me that they must be pretty successful. That's another big potential revenue stream. While the FNAF movie has become a bit of a running joke amongst the community, studios usually have to pay the license holder to option or have the exclusive right but not obligation to produce the film. If the film actually ends up getting made, they have to pay Scott a whole lot more. Considering FNAF's massive popularity, as well as Scott's hands-on involvement with the film, I wouldn't be surprised if he made an absolutely killer deal. Help Wanted was a big success too. While it was a VR game with a limited audience at first, it still sold a respectable 420,000 copies on Steam. Yo! And at a much higher price point than the classic FNAF games. Help Wanted is $30 with the occasional discounts to $21 and recently $15. Again, conservatively, let's estimate that the average sale price was $23, which gives us a gross revenue of just under $10 million. After giving Steam 30%, Scott and Steel Wool take home just under $7 million in revenue. We can't just add that money to our running count though, because Help Wanted had an actual budget, with Steel Wool and other contracted studios working on the game. Still, even after those expenses, I'm sure Scott took home a good chunk of money, $1 or $2 million probably. Security Breach gets even more complicated. We can't really begin to speculate as to how much money it made. Steel Wool described the game as being made by a small team with a shoestring budget, but it obviously cost a lot of money. In this case, we don't know exactly how Scott financed the game, if there are any other investors who get a piece, how big the budget was, Steel Wool's operating costs. There are just too many unknowns. However, despite the game's troubled development and numerous delays, Security Breach was definitely a big financial success. It made a lot of money, likely more than any other FNAF game has in its launch window. So while I can't put a number to it, I'm sure Scott personally took home a few $1 million from Security Breach sales. Perhaps even tens of millions, though I'm a little skeptical it was quite that much. Still, it was more than Help help wanted, that's for sure. I actually mentioned the elephant in the room early in the video. The true reward of Security Breach's success, and the whole franchise success really, comes from the merchandising opportunities. FNAF merch is huge, it's everywhere, it sells. There are a lot of ways to do merch deals, and we're obviously not privy to Scott's individual agreements. However, usually the license holder, in this case Scott, just sells the license to the manufacturer. They pay him for the right to produce FNAF toys, and then they take on all the effort that goes into actually producing, distributing, marketing, and ultimately selling the merchandise. They take on all the risk. At most, Scott just needs to sign off on the merch and cash his checks. It's a pretty awesome situation to be in. In some cases, Scott could probably even throw his weight around and demand a sizable portion of the net sales on top of a flat upfront license fee. To understand just how powerful merchandising can be, we need to look at Star Wars. When George Lucas was negotiating to make the first Star Wars film, he agreed to have his paycheck for the film lowered by $500,000 in exchange for being able to retain the merchandising rights to the films. It was these very merchandising rights that would lead Lucas to becoming one of the richest people in the world. With this in mind, considering just how prolific and successful the FNAF merchandise has been, I think the $60 million estimate for Scott Cawthon's net worth is actually low. I suspect he's worth closer to $100 million, if not more. When Scott's donation controversy occurred, he stepped away from his public-facing role in the community. Since then, FNAF has matured a lot, and the series has grown bigger than him. That's awesome, and building a franchise that becomes bigger than yourself is something to be really proud of. Steel Wool has been brought on, and however you feel about it, it looks like they're set to take over the FNAF franchise for the foreseeable future. All their projects with Scott have been pretty irrefutable financial successes. Imagine you're Scott Cawthon. You're already sitting on tens of millions of dollars from the success of your series. You're no longer making the games yourself, but you feel they're in good hands. The merch machine is constantly buzzing, printing money every day. Scott doesn't really need to do anything. He can essentially retire and let the franchise run itself as he passively collects money from it and builds his fortune. Why would he ever sell the franchise? Let's look at it from the other side of things. FNAF is trendy right now, and everyone knows that. Security Breach was, in spite of its problems, the biggest release the series has ever seen, and it's never been more ingrained in the mainstream public consciousness. The series has never been worth more, and while Scott surely made a huge amount of cash from the games, the vast majority of his wealth still comes from holding the FNAF IP itself. He can't just stop caring about his franchise that's potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If things go south and the franchise falls off, that intellectual property could end up losing a ton of value. No matter what anyone says, FNAF is certainly not too big to fail, even today. The series is big and it has a bright future ahead, but it needs to be carefully maintained. If the next couple of games end up being underwhelming or disappointing or whatever, Scott could find that offers to buy the franchise are suddenly half of what they once were. Now imagine that today, some big company like Disney approaches you and offers you $200 million or something to buy the franchise from you right now. No strings attached, you hand over the franchise, wash your hands of it, and you collect $200 million. That's insane money. While it's true that you probably stand to make even more over the next, 10, 20, 30 years by just retaining ownership of FNAF and continuing to oversee it, that's a lot of work. There's definitely an appeal to driving off into the sunset with your massive piles of money and just chilling on the beach, buying whatever you want, knowing that neither you nor your kids nor your grandkids will ever have to worry about money. If FNAF somehow turns out to be a very prolonged fad and dies off, you don't care. You got your money. You're good. Plus, these deals are often financed in such a way where Scott would be paid a substantial amount in Disney or whatever company that buys its stock. This way, if the franchise continues to thrive, the value of your shares increases and you end up benefiting regardless, but with the added flexibility of being able to sell those shares for cash as you please. I know some of you will probably balk at the idea of Scott selling FNAF, especially to some big conglomerate like Disney. I don't love the idea myself, but when you consider everything that's gone down with the series in the last year or so, I wouldn't blame Scott at all for wanting to just sort of cash out and chill. Put yourself in Scott's shoes. You're wealthy. You have a machine that's going to constantly give you money every month, and it's been doing so for the last 10 years. In that time, you've amassed maybe 60 million, maybe even 100 million. However, you have to maintain that machine. You have to protect it and make sure it doesn't break down or that nobody steals it or makes a better version of it or something. As long as you do that, you stand to make, say, $500 million. Now imagine someone comes over to you and offers to buy that box from you for $200 million. Sure, that's less than 500 million, but you get it all at once, and you don't have to worry about protecting this box for the next few decades of your life to get it. There are no guarantees in this life, and as awkward as it sounds, you could drop dead tomorrow. With that in mind, taking the lump sum of money seems a lot more appealing to me, especially if you're middle-aged like Scott. What do you think you would do? Would you keep the box, or would you take $200 million right then and there? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching.